A brotherhood that blurred the lines between cops and killers, an empire built on murder and corruption, and a man who became Russia's most wanted. Meet Aslan Big Brother Gagiev, the mastermind behind the family, an elite gang that left a trail of destruction and death. The tale of Aslan Big Brother Gagiev could easily be mistaken for the plot of a crime thriller conjured up by Hollywood, yet it unfolds in the raw reality of Russia's shadowy underworld. Aslan Gagiev, known as the #1 killer, is a name that strikes fear and fascination in equal measure. He wasn't merely a criminal mastermind, but the architect of an extraordinary organization referred to as the Family, an elite murder squad responsible for dozens of killings. What set this group apart was not just the cold efficiency of their operations, but the chilling fact that high-ranking law enforcement officials were among their members. This story isn't just about crime, it's about the tangled, often indistinguishable relationship between Russia's criminal underworld and its law enforcement system. Russian authorities have labeled Aslan Gagiev as one of the most notorious figures in organized crime, accusing him of founding a criminal syndicate known as the Family in 2004. This group, described as an elite murder squad with over 50 members, operated with ruthless precision. According to the Russian Investigative Committee, the country's leading law enforcement agency, the Family was responsible for an astonishing toll of violence. Over 60 individuals fell victim to their activities, including law enforcement officers, government officials at both regional and municipal levels, businessmen, and civilians. These killings occurred across Moscow, the Moscow region, and the Republic of North Ossetia-Alania. As a result of investigations, 23 members of the group have been convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, with 2 receiving life sentences. What made the Family distinct was not just its scale of violence, but its internal culture. Members referred to one another as brothers, cultivating an image of themselves as enforcers of justice in their homeland of North Ossetia. They justified their actions as acts of service to the community, claiming to eliminate those who disrupted the lives of ordinary citizens. In one instance, they targeted the leaders of a notorious kidnapping gang operating in the region, presenting themselves as protectors of the people. However, the reality was far darker and more complex. The Family's targets extended well beyond criminals, as they assassinated high-ranking government officials and even innocent bystanders caught in their web of violence. Among the high-profile victims were prominent figures such as Vitaly Karyev, the mayor of Vladikavkaz, Kazbek Pagiev, North Ossetia's vice premier, Andrei Berlikov, a former KGB official, and Alexander Leonov, an officer of the investigative committee. These killings, carried out between 2008 and 2012, highlighted the organization's reach and brazenness. Despite the horrifying scale of their crimes, much about the Family remains shrouded in secrecy. Press releases from the authorities make no mention of a chilling reality. Numerous law enforcement officials were not only complicit but active members of the Family. Furthermore, the organization's funding appears to have come, at least in part, from a Russian state-owned company. These details paint a picture of a deeply intertwined relationship between organized crime and state institutions, blurring the lines between legality and criminality in modern Russia. After spending 5 hours in conversation with Gagiev, I left the cafe with a profoundly altered understanding of my country's recent history. He had, in some of the most unexpected ways, been a participant in or witness to 25 years of pivotal events that shaped Russia's trajectory. From the ethnic conflicts in the North Caucasus to the rise of a kleptocratic state entangled with organized crime, from the dramatic rescue of hostages during the Beslan school siege to the war in South Ossetia, Gagiev's life intersected with the most critical and often tragic episodes of our era. Since our meeting, Gagiev and his legal team had been working tirelessly to convince the Austrian court of his innocence. They argued that he had not been involved in any murders and that the criminal charges against him were politically motivated, driven by his popularity in his native region of Ossetia. They claimed that he was a victim of persecution by corrupt officials and members of Russia's Siloviki, powerful figures from the intelligence, military, and law enforcement sectors, whom he had allegedly bribed for years. Gagiev also stated that he had been tortured in Russia and feared he would face the same fate, or even death, if extradited. Despite these arguments, the Austrian court remained unconvinced. On June 20th, after years of legal battles and attempts to evade extradition, Aslan Gagiev was sent back to Russia. His return marked the end of one chapter in his story and the beginning of another, one likely to be defined by the same volatile forces that had shaped his life thus far. In his homeland, Aslan Gagiev is now painted as an outsider, a ruthless murderer whose removal from society is deemed essential for public safety. Yet this portrayal only scratches the surface of his complex role within the Russian state. A more accurate depiction reveals him as an integral component of a larger system, someone who fought in the state's wars and was frequently sought out by high-ranking officials for assistance. Among the extensive materials tied to the criminal investigations into the family is a revealing report listing officials connected to Gagiev. This roster includes parliamentarians, prosecutors, and police officers. However, even this documented network barely begins to capture the full scope of his influence. Through further investigation and collaboration with colleagues at Novaya Gazeta, I was able to significantly expand upon the official list. It became clear that Gagiev's network extended far beyond what was publicly acknowledged. Additional names emerged, including the head of a major department within the investigative committee, a deputy minister of industry, a senior figure from the presidential administration, and even an officer from one of the most secretive subdivisions of the Interior Ministry. The implications of these connections are staggering. Gagiev's story cannot be dismissed as merely the tale of a single criminal group or a collection of corrupt officials. Instead, it serves as a grim testament to the state of governance in modern Russia, where the boundaries between organized crime and government have all but disappeared. Gagiev was not just a criminal, he was a cog in a vast and intricate machine, a system where organized crime and state power are inseparably intertwined. My meetings with Gagiev in Vienna offered a rare glimpse into his world. Over the course of several conversations, we reached an agreement. I would document his story only if he were killed or extradited, two outcomes that, in his view, were essentially the same. Now that one of these conditions has been met, the obligation to share his story weighs heavily on me. Yet there are still obstacles to overcome. Many of the details we discussed were off the record, bound by our agreement. Even if I chose to disclose them, proving the veracity of certain claims would be nearly impossible without concrete evidence. Throughout these meetings, it became clear that powerful figures had vested interests in ensuring Gagiev's silence. He had provided protection, financial support, and career opportunities to individuals at the highest levels of power. These same people, fearful of exposure, would likely prefer to see him permanently silenced in a way he would undoubtedly understand. The whispers I heard suggested that Gagiev would never have the chance to defend himself in a courtroom. Too many influential individuals wanted his story to end quietly, away from public scrutiny. Despite these challenges, I felt a responsibility to uncover as much of the truth as possible. In investigating his claims, I relied exclusively on sources that could be verified, whether through open records, court filings, or the criminal cases of other members of the family. I also drew from Gagiev's own testimony during his extradition hearings in Austria, much of which is now publicly available. My family lived in Georgia during a tumultuous time, Gagiev recounted to the Austrian court. Then a nationalist leader, President Zviad Gamsakurdia, came to power. As an Ossetian, part of a minority group in Georgia, we faced relentless persecution. I was just a student, but I knew I had to get my family out. His voice, steady yet tinged with the weight of memory, painted a vivid picture of a nation unraveling. The judge struggled to follow Gagiev's narrative, asking repeatedly for clarity about the shifting borders and identities of the time. Was he speaking of the Soviet Union, Russia, Georgia, or the breakaway Republic of South Ossetia? It was an understandable confusion, as the late 1980s and early 1990s were marked by the rapid dissolution of the Soviet Union. For those living through the chaos, the geopolitical landscape changed so frequently that waking up in a different country from the one you went to sleep in was not uncommon. Gagiev, an Ossetian by ethnicity, belonged to a group with deep historical roots tracing back to the ancient Scythians and Alans. Their language, closely related to Pashto and Farsi, reflected their rich heritage. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ossetian people were split. North Ossetia became part of the newly formed Russian Federation, while South Ossetia was incorporated into Georgia. This division set the stage for a strained and often hostile relationship between the Ossetians and their Georgian neighbors. The tension reached a boiling point when Gamsakhurdia rose to power in 1991. Under his rule, violent clashes erupted, and Ossetians were targeted. At the time, Gagiev was a nuclear physics student in Moscow, far from the turmoil engulfing his homeland. But the plight of his family compelled him to act. "I went back to Georgia," he explained. "I gathered around 40 people, including all my relatives. We had no choice but to flee." Tragedy marked their escape. "My father's brother was killed during the persecutions," Gagiev said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "It took us 2 weeks to reach Russia on foot. There was no transport. Along the way, my sister's baby, just 2 months old, died in my arms. The journey was grueling." Eventually, the group reached North Ossetia, part of the Russian Federation, where they found refuge in an abandoned house. But even in this new land, peace eluded them. Years later, in 2004, North Ossetia would face a horrific act of violence that would deeply affect Gagiev and shape the course of his life. Islamic militants, seeking Chechnya's independence, carried out a devastating terrorist attack in the town of Beslan. They stormed a school, taking hundreds of hostages, including children. The siege ended in tragedy, with at least 333 people killed, 186 of them children. The chaotic and deadly rescue operation, involving special forces and armed locals, left scars on the community that would never fully heal. For Gagiev, this event was not just a national tragedy, it was a personal turning point, one that pushed him further into the complexities of survival, vengeance, and the blurred lines between heroism and criminality. Aslan Gagiev claims he was among those who stormed the school during the Beslan tragedy, a moment that continues to haunt him deeply. The memory of the events he shared has left an indelible mark on his life and his perception of himself. "How could we, as Ossetians, have allowed Beslan to happen?" he lamented during our first meeting in Vienna. His voice carried a mix of anger and self-reproach as he recounted the incident. "I haven't respected myself since then. How did we let them sign a repair contract with terrorists? How did we not notice that, under the pretense of carrying out repairs, armed men were smuggling weapons into the school day and night?" During his extradition hearings in Austria, Gagiev provided a harrowing account of the attack. "When we entered the school," he explained, "I saw 2 children who were completely exhausted. I dropped my machine gun to grab them. I tried to lift a girl, but I couldn't. There were explosions everywhere, people shooting. I tried again, but I couldn't lift her." He paused, his voice faltering. "Then I realized she was holding tightly onto her mother, who had been torn apart by the explosions. I had to carry both the girl and the remains of her mother." He described the scene as utter chaos. The tragedy in Beslan, he admitted, fundamentally changed the trajectory of his life. "I felt responsible," he said with a heavy heart. "I wanted to be close to my people, to help them, to ensure we could stand as a free nation." In the aftermath of the attack, Gagiev's actions and questions brought him fame among Ossetians. According to him, he gained the respect of his community by challenging the authorities on uncomfortable truths, particularly about financial aid promised to the families of victims. It was during this time, he claimed, that he encountered severe opposition from those in power. Roughly a month after the Beslan tragedy, Gagiev's growing prominence took a darker turn. He was detained in an event that would change his life forever. He explained to the Austrian judge that his trouble with the authorities began when he publicly questioned the use of funds donated to support the victims' families. Reports in the media stated that donations had poured into the Republic from all over the world, about 600 million euros, he said. But where was that money? Why couldn't grieving families afford to bury their children properly? In response, he organized a gathering of local citizens, leading them to demand the resignation of North Ossetia's president and the head of the special services. This act of defiance, he claimed, marked him as a target. Shortly thereafter, while driving to his parents' house in Beslan, Gagiev was intercepted. Masked men stopped his car, fired shots into the air, and forcibly removed him. It was the FSB, he said, referring to Russia's intelligence agency. They bundled him into their vehicle and transported him to a local FSB facility. What followed was a horrifying ordeal. To make me regain consciousness, they urinated on me, he recounted to the court. My body was covered in blood. They used a knife to carve a chessboard pattern onto my chest. They thought I was faking unconsciousness, so they urinated on my wounds, mocking me by saying, "You will be our Jesus Christ." And that was the least of it. They destroyed my internal organs. I required multiple surgeries to survive. After 5 days of relentless abuse, Gagiev was dumped at the border with Kabardino-Balkaria, left wearing nothing but a hospital gown. Gravely injured, he managed to arrange for transport to Israel, where he underwent emergency medical treatment and psychological rehabilitation to recover from the trauma. His testimony about being tortured was corroborated by Austrian experts during his extradition case. The court documents stated, "The expert conclusion of Professor Reiter confirms that the accused was not only subjected to torture but also treated in an inhumane and degrading manner." Gagiev's account of his suffering underscores a brutal chapter in his life, one that reflects the broader, often unseen struggles faced by individuals caught between power, violence, and survival in a deeply fractured system. It was during this turbulent period, according to the investigative committee, that Aslan Gagiev established the criminal organization known as the Family. Today, the Family is no longer active. Its former members have been arrested over time, subjected to interrogations, and in many cases, coerced into providing confessions. However, many of these confessions were later retracted, with individuals claiming they were obtained under torture. Despite these reversals, the testimonies of the so-called brothers collectively paint a detailed and consistent picture of the structure and operations of the organization. At the core of the Family was a strict hierarchy, with each member referred to as a brother. At the top stood Gagiev, who was known as Big Brother or Elder Brother, a title that underscored his authority. The organization was divided into smaller units, referred to as brigades by investigators, each led by its own commander who reported directly to Gagiev. The Family operated with significant resources at its disposal. Members received funds for various needs, including purchasing clothes and vehicles, renting apartments, covering medical expenses, and even pursuing education. They had access to an impressive arsenal of weapons, many of which were of a caliber typically reserved for special forces. Investigators found that these weapons were largely sourced from South Ossetia, where Gagiev's influence extended. Membership in the Family came with strict rules. According to interrogations, leaving the group or acting against its interests was considered an act of treason, punishable by death. This unyielding code created a sense of loyalty within the ranks, although it also bred fear. One of the key figures alongside Gagiev in creating the Family was Sergei Beglarian, also known by the nickname the Armenian. Beglarian, a university friend of Gagiev's, played a crucial role in the organization, leading one of its most active brigades. According to interrogation records, this brigade specialized in carrying out assassinations, euphemistically referred to as working within the group's internal slang. The process of joining the Family was informal but symbolic. Gagiyev, a longtime member, recalled, "There were no oaths or formal ceremonies. At some point, Gagiev and Beglarian simply declared everyone to be part of the Family and called them brothers. Later, when new members joined, they would shake hands with them and declare them brothers as well." A significant number of the Family's members were Ossetians, and many were motivated by a sense of patriotism. They believed they were fighting for the betterment of their homeland, North Ossetia. Gagiev is a respected figure in Moscow, one member testified. He cares deeply about the future of North Ossetia. His goal was to restore order, to rid the region of bad people, and he needed true patriots to achieve this. For the brothers, this mission sometimes involved extreme measures, including taking lives. They justified these killings as acts of justice, targeting individuals they deemed threats to the community. Even now, years after the group's dissolution, several members of the family maintain their beliefs. In court, some brothers steadfastly defended their actions, asserting that they had acted with honor and justice. It's true that many of the family's victims were criminals themselves, murderers, kidnappers, and others who had preyed on the vulnerable. However, the reality of the family's operations was far more complicated. Not all of their victims fit the profile of a dangerous criminal. Innocent bystanders were also killed, caught in the crossfire of the family's missions. Others were targeted over disputes involving money. Additionally, while many members were driven by a genuine desire to serve their homeland, others joined the family for entirely different reasons. Among the brothers were law enforcement officers, individuals whose motivations often had little to do with patriotism and more to do with personal gain or corruption. Among the many figures who joined the ranks of the family, few were as emblematic of its disturbing reach into law enforcement as Yevgeny Yashkin. Once celebrated as a hero of the Chechen Wars and a recipient of the prestigious Order of Courage, Yashkin's transformation into a willing participant in the family's heinous activities highlights the blurred lines between those who enforce the law and those who break it. His descent into the criminal underworld began in 2004, shortly after the family's formation, when he was 36 years old and serving in the Interior Ministry's Office for Combating Organized Crime in Moscow's southwestern district. When Yashkin first encountered Aslan Gagiev, he did not know him as the infamous criminal mastermind, but as a businessman using one of his many pseudonyms, Valery Nikolaevich. Gagiev, who possessed several passports under various identities, approached Yashkin with what seemed like a harmless offer, a side job that would pay 30,000 to 40,000 rubles per month, approximately $1,100 to $1,400 at the time. The job was framed as a private security role, with responsibilities including serving as a bodyguard and transporting goods and documents. Given Yashkin's status as a police officer, his official identification made him a valuable asset, allowing him to move items without the risk of inspection by his colleagues. In reality, his role was far from innocent, and his new employer was anything but legitimate. Yashkin's tacit agreement to join the family was solidified when he participated in his first crime, the abduction and subsequent murder of businessman Dmitry Plitnik. Plitnik was the owner of the Nationalny Capital Bank and had become a target after betraying a friend of Gagiev. According to Yashkin's later testimony, he learned about the planned crime during a casual conversation in a car. Sitting alongside Gagiev and a mutual acquaintance, Yashkin listened as the acquaintance requested Gagiev's assistance in exacting revenge on Plitnik. Without hesitation, Gagiev agreed to the gruesome favor. The execution of the plan was methodical. Members of the family, dressed as law enforcement officers, abducted Plitnik near his home, handcuffed him, and transported him to the F1 Ultra M Cafe on Lodogneya Street in Moscow. This cafe served as the family's primary headquarters in the city. Although Yashkin did not witness the actual killing, he arrived at the scene after Plitnik had been murdered. The banker's lifeless body had already been placed in a Ford minibus parked in the cafe's yard. What followed was a chilling initiation. Yashkin was instructed to drive the minibus, utilizing his police credentials to avoid suspicion if they were stopped. His task was simple yet horrifying: dispose of the body. He drove the vehicle to a location near the city of Dubna in the Moscow region, where the corpse was dumped into the Volga River. This act marked the beginning of Yashkin's involvement in the family's operations. Far from being a one-time occurrence, it was the first of 25 murders in which Yashkin played a role. After joining the family, Yevgeny Yashkin rose to a new level of influence and operational capacity within his dual roles as both a criminal and a member of law enforcement. In 2005, he became part of the Special Rapid Reaction Unit of the Ministry of the Interior in the Moscow region, a position that not only provided him with resources and authority but also extended the family's reach into one of the most critical arms of law enforcement. It was during this time that Yashkin introduced two of his colleagues from the unit to Aslan Gagiev. These colleagues, drawn in by Gagiev's charisma and promises of loyalty, became members of the family and soon found themselves involved in one of the organization's most brutal crimes. In 2006, Yashkin, along with other brothers, orchestrated the abduction and execution of 4 individuals in the Moscow region. According to testimonies provided during later investigations, Gagiev described the victims as scumbags and bastards who had been harassing and threatening a man and his family while extorting money. Gagiev framed their capture and execution as a form of justice, insisting that these individuals deserved to be punished. The operation began with meticulous planning. Disguised as policemen, a disguise unnecessary for many of the brothers since they actually held positions in law enforcement, they arrived at the house of the man who had sought Gagiev's help. There, they waited for the targets to arrive. Once the victims were in sight, the brothers sprang into action, abducting them and transporting them to an isolated location. The 4 men were restrained with handcuffs, forced into a car, and driven to a remote ravine. At the edge of the ravine, the captives were forced to kneel. What followed was an execution as cold-blooded as it was systematic. Each victim was shot in the head, one after another. Yashkin, stationed in a car nearby, witnessed the killings unfold. The man who carried out the executions with chilling precision was Maxim Nikolaev, known within the family by the nickname Pioneer or Young One. Nikolaev's involvement underscored the alarming extent of the family's infiltration into law enforcement. Not only was he a member of the family, but he also held a position in one of the most secretive divisions of the Interior Ministry, the Operative Search Bureau in Moscow. This elite department specialized in the surveillance of foreigners, earning its officers the nickname Topchini, a term meaning footstompers within law enforcement circles, referring to their dogged pursuit of targets. After the execution, the scene was methodically erased. The bodies were drenched in gasoline and set ablaze, ensuring minimal evidence remained. This act of destruction was emblematic of the family's operations, ruthless efficiency combined with a meticulous attention to covering their tracks. Even among the ranks of the family, where brutality and violence were commonplace, Maxim Nikolaev stood out as one of its most merciless killers. Feared even by his fellow brothers, Nikolaev operated under the command of Sergei Beglarian, the co-founder of the family and leader of one of its most active working groups. Together, the two were responsible for one of the most gruesome and excessive crimes the family ever committed, the slaughter of Alexander Slesarev and his family in 2005. This particular massacre was part of a calculated murder-for-hire scheme. According to Yevgeny Yashkin's later testimony, the banker Slesarev was targeted because of his involvement in financial corruption. Slesarev, who was marked for death, owned 2 major Russian banks. One of them was Saad Business Bank. I don't recall the name of the second one. The person who ordered the hit had a vested interest in these banks. Slesarev had deliberately bankrupted them, siphoning off assets worth billions of rubles, Yashkin explained. Slesarev's troubles were widely known. He had been embroiled in a financial scandal, accused of stealing from his depositors. In fact, just a year prior to his murder, the Russian Central Bank had revoked Saad Business Bank's license due to extensive legal violations, including money laundering for organized crime. On October 15, 2005, Slesarev's 15-year-old daughter Elizaveta returned home to Moscow from the United Kingdom, where she had been studying. She had come back on holiday to spend time with her family. The following morning, the family decided to visit a monastery in Stary Oskol, a city more than 600 kilometers south of Moscow near the Ukrainian border. They traveled in 2 cars. In the first car were Alexander, his wife Natalia, their daughter Elizaveta, and their young niece Sofia. The second car carried Sofia's father, Slesarev's brother-in-law, a driver, and a nun from the revered Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. Unbeknownst to them, their movements were being tracked. A family member working in law enforcement had tapped Slesarev's phone, revealing his route to the assassins. As the family headed toward the monastery, the brothers were already in pursuit. The attack began when the brothers caught up with the second car. Nikolaev, driving recklessly, opened fire from his vehicle. The car came to an abrupt stop after one of the bullets struck Slesarev's brother-in-law in the back of the head. Although gravely injured, he survived. The nun, however, was not so fortunate. A single shot pierced her forehead, killing her instantly. Next, the brothers targeted the lead car carrying Slesarev and his immediate family. Blocking the Mercedes on the road, Nikolaev and Beglarian stepped out and began firing at the vehicle from a distance of about 10 meters. The assault was ruthless. Slesarev, his wife Natalia, and their teenage daughter Elizaveta were killed in the barrage of bullets. Young Sofia, struck in the chest, miraculously survived the attack but was gravely wounded. At just 23 years old, Nikolaev carried out this atrocity with chilling detachment, a hallmark of his role within the family. Yet, he was not an outlier. His actions were reflective of a broader culture of violence and corruption that permeated the family's operations. Nikolaev and other members of his unit, drawn from a top-secret department of the Interior Ministry known for its elite surveillance capabilities, were deeply embedded in the criminal underworld. This department, colloquially referred to as the Topchini or Footstompers, had a reputation for doing the dirty work of both law enforcement and criminal syndicates. The influence of this unit extended far beyond the family. Its members played pivotal roles in other high-profile crimes. For instance, they conducted surveillance on Paul Klebnikov, the editor-in-chief of Forbes Russia, before his assassination in 2004. 2 years later, they tracked Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist for Novaya Gazeta. The intelligence they gathered was handed over to Chechen hitmen who carried out the killings of both journalists. By the mid-2000s, North Ossetia was plagued by a horrifying epidemic of kidnappings for ransom. Criminal groups, emboldened by the ineffectiveness of law enforcement, targeted families indiscriminately, turning the region into a hotbed of fear and despair. For years, the authorities did little to stem the tide of abductions. Families were left to negotiate with kidnappers, often paying exorbitant ransoms to secure the return of their loved ones. Then, almost as suddenly as the crisis had begun, it stopped. The turning point came after a series of high-profile cases in 2006 and 2007. In November 2006, Ludwig Zasiev, the 20-year-old son of an Ossetian entrepreneur, was kidnapped. He was held in a pit at a private residence, with his captors demanding an astronomical ransom of $5 million for his release. After tense negotiations, the ransom was reduced to $700,000, which the family managed to pay. Ludwig was freed after 2 months in captivity, but the incident left a scar on the community. Just months later, in August 2007, another abduction sent shockwaves through the region. This time, the victim was Sherman Mirakov, a wealthy businessman from Moscow. His captors demanded $10 million from his family. The year-long ordeal weighed heavily on his wife, who told Kommersant, "Every day, I lived in fear of receiving a severed ear or finger in the mail. My husband's brother had already lost his index finger to kidnappers in Chechnya, and I knew how cruel these people could be." Desperate, the family scrambled to gather the ransom. However, the deal fell apart when the intermediary, tasked with delivering the payment, vanished along with the money. Tragically, Mirakov was killed. The man behind this string of crimes was identified as Artur Kipa Bekmerzov, according to the investigative committee. Kipa was no ordinary criminal. He had a powerful protector, his brother, Kazbek Bekmerzov. A senior police official in North Ossetia, Kazbek held positions as Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs and Chief of Police. His influence within law enforcement was significant, likely explaining why the kidnappings persisted for so long without intervention. Despite mounting evidence, Kazbek staunchly defended his brother, telling Kommersant in 2013, "My brother was no saint, but I'm convinced he had nothing to do with the kidnappings of his fellow countrymen." But not everyone shared Kazbek's confidence. Following Mirakov's death, something remarkable happened. The kidnappings stopped abruptly. The men suspected of orchestrating these crimes began to disappear, one by one. Some were found dead, others simply vanished without a trace. Rumors spread through the region like wildfire. People whispered about a vigilante, a figure operating outside the law, who was systematically hunting down those responsible. Some likened this mysterious figure to a Robin Hood, a savior of the oppressed. Others invoked a name steeped in Ossetian mythology, Bartier. In Ossetian folklore, Bartier is a powerful and enigmatic figure, the ruler of the underworld who judges the souls of the dead, deciding their eternal fate. To the people of North Ossetia, this mythical judge seemed to have come to life, delivering a brand of justice that the official authorities had failed to provide. But who was this modern-day Bartier? Was he a member of the family, acting on Aslan Gagiev's orders? Or was he an independent actor, a man driven by a personal vendetta against the kidnappers who had terrorized his homeland? The answer remains shrouded in mystery, buried beneath layers of fear, silence, and myth. What is certain, however, is that the emergence of this so-called Bartier marked the end of an era of unchecked violence in North Ossetia. While his methods were brutal and extrajudicial, they struck at the heart of the criminal networks that had thrived for years under the protection of corrupt officials. Whether viewed as a hero, a villain, or something in between, the legend of Bartier endures, a reflection of the desperation, anger, and thirst for justice that had taken root in a community abandoned by the system meant to protect it. The story of Oleg Gagiev, nicknamed Boat, meaning child in Ossetian, adds another layer of intrigue and complexity to the shadowy world of the family. Despite sharing a last name, Boat had no familial connection to Aslan big brother Gagiev. Instead, he emerged as a pivotal figure in the family's campaign against North Ossetia's criminal underbelly, particularly targeting Artur Kipa Bekmrazov's kidnapping gang and others the family deemed as scumbags. According to the investigative committee, it was Boat's team that carried out high-profile assassinations, including the killings of Vitaly Karyev, the mayor of Vladikavkaz, and Kazbek Pagiev, the former vice premier of the North Ossetian government. Boat's background was as murky as his operations. He worked as a counterintelligence operative for the unrecognized Republic of South Ossetia. However, within the family, there was widespread belief that his true allegiance lay with the FSB, Russia's powerful security agency. This connection was reinforced during an interview on the TV program Chestny Detective, Honest Detective, where sniper Einal Ostyev, who carried out Karyev's assassination for Boat's group, described the rationale behind their missions. "These people we kill," Ostyev explained, "are problems for Ossetia. They've done bad things. That's what I was told. Kidnapped children, robbed people. I was told by them, the family, that this is needed in Moscow, that the FSB wants it." Law enforcement agencies were not blind to Boat's activities. As early as 2007, Boat and his associates were facing triple murder charges. Remarkably, however, they were acquitted by a jury. This acquittal raised eyebrows, and subsequent revelations pointed to the possibility that Big Brother had played a significant role in securing their freedom. Robert Gagiev, a brother known by the nickname Robson, later revealed key details during his testimony. He recalled meeting Boat for the first time in November 2007 near the Crocus City Mall along Moscow's Ring Road. According to Gagiev, Big Brother had just paid an astonishing $20 million to secure Boat's release from jail. Afterward, Gagiev drove Boat to the Lodoknaya Street Cafe, a central hub for the family, where Big Brother formally introduced him as their newest brother. Boat quickly became integral to the family's operations. Shortly after joining, he had a critical conversation with Big Brother that would set the stage for dismantling Kipa's kidnapping gang. Gagiev, who overheard the exchange, recounted how Boat warned Big Brother about a conspiracy against him. He revealed that Kipa, along with two associates named Lasha and Gudza, intended to kill him. Boat's knowledge of the trio stemmed from his past. He had once been involved in stealing cars with them in Moscow. Over time, under Kipa's leadership, the three had evolved into a notorious kidnapping gang in North Ossetia. Boat was adamant that the trio needed to be eliminated immediately, but Big Brother took a more measured approach. He suggested speaking with them first to assess the situation. Ultimately, the family pursued both options, dialogue and deadly retribution. This blend of negotiation and violence was emblematic of the family's operations, where diplomacy often served as a prelude to bloodshed. At the close of 2007, Aslan Big Brother Gagiev issued a chilling command: the abduction of Artur Bekmrazov, better known as Kipa. This directive came as part of the family's relentless campaign against those who had wronged them. Yevgeny Yashkin, the former police officer who had previously assisted in disposing of a murdered banker's body, described the elaborate plan that unfolded. The operation began with meticulous preparation. Members of the family donned black uniforms and masks to obscure their identities. Armed with imitation Kalashnikov rifles, they climbed into a Chrysler minivan and set out for a house near Moscow's Akademikskaya metro station, where Kipa resided. At approximately 9 a.m., Kipa emerged from his home and entered his Audi A8. The brothers, executing their plan with practiced precision, intercepted his car, forcibly removed him, and transported him to a secret location they referred to as their distant base near Sheremetyevo Airport. This so-called base was no ordinary hideout. Owned by Sergei Safronov, a businessman and family member, the building housed a workshop and a sauna on its first floor. Meanwhile, Kipa's Audi was taken to a car service shop controlled by Safronov, conveniently located near the family's Lodoknaya Street Cafe. The car was disassembled into pieces and its remnants scattered across multiple dump sites to erase any trace of the vehicle. While these steps were being carried out, Kipa himself was taken to Safronov's office. It was here that both Gagievs, Aslan and Oleg, known as Boat, interrogated him. According to testimonies later provided by family member Robert Gagiev, the atmosphere inside the base was tense and foreboding. Gagiev recounted witnessing the interrogation before Boat and another brother, Maxim Nikolaev, led Kipa downstairs to the sauna. What transpired next was both methodical and horrifying. Inside the sauna, Nikolaev placed a dark plastic bag over Kipa's head and wrapped it tightly with tape, covering his face from the neck to the eyes. The cruel act of asphyxiation ended Kipa's life. Gagiev noted that Safronov was nearby throughout the ordeal, nonchalantly serving scotch as the execution unfolded. After Kipa's death, the events took an even darker turn. Gagiev, seeking to distance himself from the gruesome proceedings, went upstairs to discuss unrelated matters with Big Brother. However, he was soon interrupted by Boat, who posed a macabre question: "Don't you want to take part in the dismemberment?" Gagiev declined, but Boat pressed further, urging him at least to observe. Reluctantly, Gagiev agreed and descended back to the sauna. What he encountered there left an indelible mark. Kipa's headless body lay sprawled on the floor, evidence of the brutality that had just taken place. Nearby stood Sergei Beglarian, wielding an axe, methodically dismembering the corpse. Safronov was also present, packing Kipa's severed head and hands into plastic buckets, presumably to facilitate their disposal. The disposal of Kipa's mutilated body was the grim finale to one of the family's most horrifying operations. Among those tasked with this gruesome duty was Ruslan Yurtov, a relatively new recruit who had joined the family in 2007 at the age of 25. Unlike some of the seasoned brothers, Yurtov approached the task with reluctance, torn between his survival instincts and his unease at what lay before him. Yurtov's introduction to the family came through Maxim Nikolaev, an acquaintance who suggested he visit the Lodoknaya Street Cafe, the group's central hub. It was there that he first met Aslan Big Brother Gagiev. Their conversation was direct and disarming, with Gagiev inquiring about Yurtov's background. Did he own an apartment? Was he in debt? Had he served in the army? When Yurtov confirmed his military service and his ability to handle firearms, Gagiev assured him that he would secure a position for him within the police force, emphasizing that Yurtov should serve honestly, avoid bribes, and build a career with his help. True to his word, Gagiev arranged for Yurtov to join the police in Moscow's Lomonosovsky district. Starting as a trainee, Yurtov soon advanced to the role of operative within the criminal department. The process of securing his position was facilitated by Nikolaev, who negotiated with influential figures, including a high-ranking police general, to ensure Yurtov's placement. Despite his new career, Yuratov quickly learned that his loyalty to the family would supersede any professional obligations. In December 2007, just months after joining the police, he received a summons from Nikolaev to report to the family's distant base near Sheremetyevo Airport. Unaware of what awaited him, Yuratov arrived and was directed to the sauna, where he came face to face with a shocking sight: Kipav's headless corpse lying in the shower. One of the brothers ordered Yuratov to assist in disposing of the body. Overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, Yuratov grappled with his options. In his later testimony, he explained his internal conflict. Refusing the order could mean his own death. He could easily end up lying next to Kipav in the sauna. On the other hand, the man before him was already dead. Compliance, though repugnant, seemed like the only way to preserve his own life and possibly find a way to extricate himself from the family's grasp in the future. With no real choice, Yuratov participated in the grim task. He and other brothers tied metal beams to the torso to weigh it down, then loaded it into a minibus. The vehicle was driven by Yevgeny Yashkin, a fellow brother with whom Yuratov shared a bond due to their shared experiences as veterans of the Chechen Wars. They transported the corpse to a remote location outside Moscow, where they threw it into a hole in the frozen surface of a river. Later, Nikolaev disposed of the severed body parts in the Tver region, scattering them to ensure they would not be found. But their efforts to conceal the evidence were ultimately futile. 3 years later, an amateur diver exploring a canal off the Volga River made a chilling discovery. He retrieved several white buckets from the water and opened one, only to find 2 severed hands inside. One of the hands bore a distinctive tattoo reading GSVG, an abbreviation for Grupa Sovietsky Voisk v Germanii, Group of Soviet Forces in Germany. This clue, combined with other forensic evidence, allowed investigators to identify the remains as Kipav's. The discovery marked a turning point in the investigation into the family's activities. What had once been buried in secrecy, both literally and figuratively, was now surfacing, bringing with it evidence of the family's brutal methods and the complicity of its members. For Yuratov, this grim chapter was a stark reminder of how deeply entangled he had become in the family's web of violence, a bond forged through fear and sealed by blood. The family's relentless campaign against the kidnapping gang continued to escalate, dragging reluctant members like Ruslan Yuratov deeper into its web of violence and fear. After participating in the disposal of Kipav's body, Yuratov attempted to distance himself from the group, claiming his police work as an excuse. But Nikolaev, the man who had recruited him, refused to let him go. "Forget about your wife and child," Nikolaev warned, emphasizing that Yuratov's loyalty belonged to the family. His chilling message was clear: leaving the family was impossible without paying the ultimate price. Sergei Beglarian reinforced this threat, bluntly stating that if Yuratov continued to shirk his responsibilities, they would break his leg with a bat. In January 2008, Yuratov was assigned another task. This time, he was instructed to wait near a car wash on Moscow's Garden Ring and watch for a vehicle with specific license plates. When the target arrived, Yuratov made the call to Nikolaev, setting the plan into motion. Moments later, a Chrysler van belonging to the family pulled up. Armed brothers, dressed as police officers and masked with balaclavas, stormed the car wash, brandishing imitation Kalashnikov rifles and shouting commands. Their target was Lasha Avlokashvili, an associate of Kipav involved in the kidnapping operations. Unfortunately for Lasha, he wasn't alone. His friend, nicknamed the Georgian, happened to be with him. The brothers abducted both men and took them to the office of the financial leasing company on Makarenko Street, a state-run business tied to Gagiev that played a central role in financing the family's activities. Once there, Lasha became the focus of an intense interrogation. According to testimonies, the brothers were particularly interested in details about the kidnapping of Ludwig Zasyev's son. At first, Lasha denied any involvement. However, under brutal torture, both beating him with a billiard ball wrapped in a hat and Nikolaev pouring boiling water on his back, Lasha broke, revealing everything, including how the ransom money had been divided. With his confession extracted, Lasha and the Georgian were transported to the family's base near the airport. Zasiev was summoned to the base as well, where Big Brother confronted him with the supposed mastermind behind his son's abduction. According to Gagiev's testimony, Big Brother even offered Zasiev the opportunity to kill Lasha himself. When Zasiev refused, Big Brother ordered Nikolaev to carry out the execution. Lasha's fate mirrored Kipav's. A plastic bag was placed over his head, and it was secured with tape, suffocating him to death. By the time Yurtov arrived at the base, the gruesome deed was already done. Lasha's lifeless body lay nearby. The Georgian, however, was still alive, pleading for his life. According to Yurtov, the Georgian claimed he was dying of AIDS and wouldn't live long enough to pose any threat to the family. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Both coldly ordered his execution as well. What followed was a grotesque scene of dismemberment. One of the brothers went to a nearby store and returned with axes, knives, rubber gloves, and plastic wrap, preparing for the macabre task. The corpses were stripped of their clothing and documents, which Safronov later destroyed in the sauna's firebox. The dismemberment process was methodical. The heads were severed first, followed by the hands, arms, and legs. The torsos were left intact, but care was taken to prevent the walls of the base from being stained with blood, a concern voiced by Safronov. To facilitate the chopping, wooden boards were placed under the bodies. Once the limbs were removed, the severed heads and hands were placed in buckets, which were filled with mortar by Safronov to ensure their disposal. These grisly rituals were conducted under the cover of night, as the brothers worked with disturbing efficiency to erase any trace of their crimes. Safronov, despite his active role in these horrific acts, was not just another brother. He played a pivotal role in financing the family, running a network of companies that siphoned money from the state budget. By day, he was a businessman directing complex schemes to fund the family's operations. By night, he was a willing participant in its most brutal and gruesome activities, embodying the chilling duality that defined many members of the family. Sergei Safronov, a figure shrouded in mystery and complexity, was far more than a mere member of the family. Born in Mariupol, a small town in Ukraine's Zhytomyr region, Safronov had lived in St. Petersburg during the turbulent 1990s. The exact details of how he became entangled with the family remain unclear, but his importance within the organization is beyond doubt. Safronov held a critical economic role, serving as the custodian of many of the assets that sustained the family's operations. His name appeared on the ownership papers of numerous properties and businesses that were instrumental to the group's activities. Among the assets linked to Safronov was a 50% stake in Texmaster TM3, a car service on Lodoknaya Street in Moscow. This was no ordinary auto repair shop. It was the location where vehicles belonging to the family's victims were systematically dismantled and destroyed. Safronov was also a co-owner of the F1 Ultra M Cafe, situated on the same street. This cafe wasn't just a place for casual meals, it was a vital hub for the family, offering free food to brothers and serving as the meeting point where murder plots were discussed and finalized. One of Safronov's most infamous properties was the warehouse complex known as Grupa Attaché, located near Sheremetyevo Airport. This distant base became a grim sight of numerous executions carried out by the family. Despite their best efforts to scrub the premises clean, investigators later uncovered traces of blood on the walls, evidence of the atrocities that had occurred there. But Safronov's influence extended far beyond his role as the keeper of these physical assets. His business ties revealed deeper connections to influential figures in Russian politics and law enforcement. At the end of 2006, Safronov co-founded a construction company called Laguna Breeze in Khimki, a city near Moscow. His business partner in this venture was Irina Zhukova, who happened to be the common-law wife of Anatoly Korotkov, a high-ranking official in the investigative committee. Korotkov had once headed one of the committee's most crucial departments and, according to Big Brother, served as a deputy to Alexander Bastrikin, the agency's powerful and controversial leader. Korotkov's role as a senior official tasked with combating corruption raises unsettling questions about his connection to the family. While Jukava, when questioned by reporters, acknowledged recognizing the name Laguna Breeze, she denied knowing Safronov and claimed no memory of the company's activities or why she was listed as a founder. This murky explanation only deepened suspicions about the overlap between the family's operations and high-level corruption in Russian institutions. Safronov's involvement with such figures highlights the symbiotic relationship between organized crime and political power in Russia. The family's ability to operate with impunity, using properties like Grupa Attaché for murders and businesses like Laguna Breeze for laundering money, was made possible by these connections. Safronov was not merely a logistical operator, he was a linchpin in the economic and political machinery that allowed the family to thrive. His ties to figures like Karakov suggest a disturbing alignment between those entrusted with fighting corruption and the very criminal networks they were supposed to dismantle. In an Austrian courtroom, Aslan Gagiev painted a stark and unsettling picture of how crime and business are intertwined in Russia. He detailed a system where corruption was not just common but essential for survival. According to Gagiev, even the country's highest anti-corruption officials were deeply entangled in this web. All business in Russia is structured in such a way that it's impossible to operate without paying off those in power, Gagiev explained to the judge. There are specific amounts for each level of business. Through my organization, I was paying 1.2 million euros every month to Alexander Bastrikin at the investigative committee. By my organization, Gagiev was referring to the financial leasing company, a state-owned enterprise tasked with advancing Russia's commercial aircraft industry. The company's role was straightforward: purchase airplanes from domestic manufacturers and lease them to airlines, which often lacked the capital to buy the planes outright. To support this mission, the government funneled billions of rubles into the FLK. Despite having no official position within the company, Gagiev wielded immense influence over its operations. Employees and even directors reported directly to him. Known to them as Valery Nikolaevich, he was viewed with a mix of awe and fear. He carried himself like someone of great importance, the chief accountant later recalled. We assumed he was with the FSB because of the way he looked at everyone. However, Gagiev's payments to the investigative committee eventually ceased to protect him. He told the Austrian court that the money he was funneling to Bastrikin stopped reaching its intended destination, triggering his troubles with the Russian authorities. One day, I had an unexpected meeting with one of Bastrikin's deputies, a department head, Gagiev recounted, likely referring to Anatoly Karakov. At first, everything was fine. I gave him money as part of doing business. Then he asked me how the business was going, and I told him, better than before. After that, the problems began. Either my partner failed to pass the money to Bastrikin, or Karakov himself kept it. Gagiev's allegations might seem like a strategy to politicize his extradition fight, but certain details lend credence to his claims. For instance, there is a direct connection between the family and investigative committee officials, as evidenced by Safronov's joint business venture with Karakov's common-law wife, Irina Jukava. Safronov, who was integral to the family's operations, co-founded the construction company Laguna Breeze with Jukava in 2006. Jukava denied knowing Safronov and claimed no memory of the company's activities, but her involvement tied her indirectly to the family. Further evidence came from documents discovered on the computer of Sergei Lychenko, the FLK's legal advisor. These files, uncovered during investigations into the company's collapse, included a power of attorney signed by Jukava authorizing Lychenko to handle transactions involving her properties in Moscow and the Black Sea town of Anapa. Additional documents showed Lychenko facilitating real estate deals on Jukava's behalf, suggesting a deeper connection between her and the family's financial dealings. When questioned, Jukava admitted to granting power of attorney to Lychenko for specific property transactions but downplayed the significance. Imagine you're unwell, and a friend recommends a doctor. That's all this was, she explained. She also confirmed her partnership with Karakov, defending his reputation. By 60, a man can have hundreds of contacts, she said. Theoretically, Karakov could have known someone from the FLK. Officials like him meet many people. You can't predict if someone you meet will turn out to be a fraudster or killer. Her defense, however, did little to dispel the evidence linking high-ranking officials to the family's criminal network. The documents found on Lychenko's computer were not merely incidental, they pointed to a system where corruption at the highest levels enabled the family's operations. Safronov's businesses, tied to figures like Karakov, revealed how deeply the family had infiltrated state structures. The files recovered from Sergei Lychenko's computer uncovered a web of financial transactions that hinted at the scale of corruption and the reach of the family's influence. Among the documents was a 2008 loan agreement for 28.3 million rubles, approximately $1 million, between a company called Greenwood and Nina Kalamanova. Kalamanova had been employed at the financial leasing company from 2005 to 2009, initially serving as deputy director of the legal department and later as an advisor to the general director. A loan of this magnitude was highly unusual for someone in her professional position, raising immediate suspicions about its purpose and origin. Adding to the intrigue was Kalamanova's family connection. She is the sister of Georgy Kalamanov, who currently serves as Russia's Deputy Minister of Industry and Trade. At the time of the transaction, he was the director of one of the ministry's departments. The loan appeared to be tied to Kalamanova's purchase of a luxury apartment in the exclusive Solnechny Bereg community on Moscow's prestigious Myshurin Prospect, a property well beyond the means of an average FLK employee. The company that issued the loan, Greenwood, showed every sign of being a shell entity created solely for this transaction. It had no record of making mandatory insurance payments to the pension fund, and when authorities attempted to hold it accountable in 2009, they discovered it was a ghost. The organization at the indicated address did not exist, the court reported. By 2010, Greenwood had been officially removed from Russia's registry of legal entities as a non-existent company. What made this transaction even more suspect was the speed with which Kalamanova cleared her debt. Documents on Lychenko's computer revealed that she repaid the entire 28.3 million rubles, including interest, just 2 months after taking the loan, and in cash. The metadata on the file showed that the loan agreement, the cash deposit receipt, and the repayment confirmation were all created and edited on the same day, May 12, 2008. This strongly suggested that the paperwork had been fabricated after the fact to justify the funds used to purchase the apartment. The implications were clear. This was no ordinary loan. The evidence pointed to the FLK facilitating the acquisition of a luxury apartment for Kalamanova, likely as a favor to her brother, Deputy Minister Georgy Kalamanov. When asked for comment on this apparent transaction, Kalamanov did not respond. This deal aligns with the claims Aslan Gagiev made during his testimony in Austria. According to Gagiev, he was required to make significant payments to maintain favorable relations with government officials, including those in the Ministry of Industry. I paid another 1.2 million euros to the minister, Gagiev testified. We were under the Ministry of Industry's jurisdiction. Altogether, I had to pay 2.4 million euros every month, euro 1.2 million to the investigative committee and another 1.2 million euros to the Ministry of Industry. This wasn't just me, my partners also had to contribute. But I was responsible for ensuring the money reached the right people. These revelations paint a vivid picture of how the family's operations were intertwined with high-ranking officials and government institutions. Through payments and favors, Gagiev had cultivated relationships that extended to the upper echelons of Russian bureaucracy. The FLK, ostensibly created to support Russia's aviation industry, had instead become a conduit for financial transactions that benefited powerful individuals. Aslan Gagiev's connections extended beyond the realm of ordinary criminal enterprises, weaving a web that tied him to figures of immense influence in both Russia's underworld and its political elite. These connections illustrate the blurred lines between organized crime and government power, where allegiances and debts transcend traditional boundaries. On one hand, Gagiev maintained ties with a notorious criminal, a member of the Tambov organized crime group who had fled Russia for Spain. This individual was later arrested but managed to escape after posting bail, symbolizing the impunity often enjoyed by high-level criminals with the right connections. On the other hand, Gagiev's most intriguing relationship was with a mysterious, unnamed member of Russia's presidential administration, a shadowy figure whose identity remains unknown but who played a pivotal role in shaping Gagiev's rise. According to documents from criminal investigations into the brothers, Gagiev's relationship with the presidential administration began in the 1990s, when he served a prison sentence for an economic crime. The twist? Gagiev reportedly took the fall for this high-ranking official, ensuring that the latter remained unscathed. This act of loyalty created a debt that was never forgotten. This acquaintance plays an important role in the life of A.M. Gagiev, the document states, adding that the relationship allowed Gagiev to build connections with influential figures within the Russian government. This repayment of a long-standing debt cemented Gagiev's access to the corridors of power. Parallel to his political connections, Gagiev also had ties to the leaders of the Tambov organized crime group, whose influence extended into Russia's financial and political systems. The Tambov group's reach was vast, with stakes in institutions like Bank Russia, a financial giant from St. Petersburg often referred to as the jewel of President Putin's financial empire. According to the U.S. Treasury, Bank Russia's shareholders included close associates of Putin, further blurring the lines between state power and organized crime. For years, the Tambov leaders used their connections within Russia's elite to solidify their power base, moving seamlessly between their roles as gangsters and businessmen. The financial leasing company, where Gagiev held significant influence, mirrored this duality. Nominally a state enterprise tasked with advancing Russia's aviation industry, its operations also served the interests of criminal groups like the Tambov organization. The FLK's board of directors included high-ranking officials from the presidential administration and other government bodies, ostensibly responsible for ensuring that state funds were used appropriately. However, in practice, the FLK staff reported directly to Gagiev, and even more alarmingly, to Gennady Petrov, a leader of the Tambov group. Petrov's influence extended far beyond the FLK. Over years of wiretapping, Spanish police uncovered his extraordinary connections within Russia's political and military elite. Petrov arranged meetings with former Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov, maintained close ties with Duma member Vladislav Reznik, received privileged information from Nikolai Oliv, the deputy director of the Federal Drug Control Service, and even covered medical expenses for Igor Sobolevsky, a former deputy to Alexander Bastrikin of the Investigative Committee. Petrov also had business dealings with Ivan Malyushin, a former deputy director of the Presidential Affairs Department, and many others. The FLK's general director, Nail Malyutin, was another link in this chain of influence. Malyutin, who worked closely with Petrov, treated him as the de facto authority over the company, reporting every major decision to him as though Petrov, rather than the government, were the FLK's primary shareholder. In one intercepted conversation, Malyutin told Petrov, "You're the helmsman of the convoy, and we're just here to hand you the shells. I wipe them down, and the others hand them to you." Nail Malyutin and Sergei Safronov were pivotal figures in the intricate web of the financial leasing company and its connections to the family. Their roles bridged the gap between organized crime and the state, making them indispensable to the operations of both the company and the criminal network it facilitated. In his testimony to investigators, Malyutin recounted how he first encountered Aslan Gagiev in 2001, a meeting orchestrated by Safronov, a longtime acquaintance from his days in St. Petersburg. This introduction would eventually bind Malyutin to the shadowy world of the family. The early 2000s marked a significant shift in Russian politics and power dynamics. Following Vladimir Putin's ascent to the presidency, a wave of his close associates from St. Petersburg moved to Moscow, assuming influential positions in government. This migration, often referred to as the arrival of the Petersburg crew, created a network of familiar faces in the capital, a network that Malyutin was eager to leverage. Malyutin himself moved to Moscow, hoping to capitalize on his connections, particularly with German Greff, a figure he had worked alongside in the 1990s at the Committee for Management of State Property in St. Petersburg. By the early 2000s, Greff had risen to become Russia's Minister of Trade and Economic Development. The St. Petersburg ties functioned in Moscow, Malyutin explained during his testimony. Once in the capital, he reconnected with Safronov, who invited him to join a football game. It was there, in the informal setting of a sports hall, that Malyutin first met Aslan Gagiev and Andrei Berlikov. At the time, Berlikov, a former KGB foreign intelligence officer, was serving as FLK's deputy general director. According to Malyutin, Berlikov soon offered him a position at the FLK but attached a specific condition. Malyutin was to use his connections to help the company secure a critical government tender for leasing commercial aircraft. To fulfill this requirement, Malyutin turned to Gref, leveraging their long-standing relationship. "I asked Gref to use his influence to push FLK's bids forward," Malyutin explained, emphasizing his gratitude for Gref's past kindness and his personal guarantee of the company's commitment to meeting its obligations. Malyutin's efforts bore fruit, the FLK won the tender, and he was subsequently named Deputy General Director. When questioned, Gref did not provide any comment on the matter. Malyutin's interactions with Gagiev deepened after he joined the FLK. During one meeting at the company's offices, Berlikov reintroduced Gagiev to him under the pseudonym Valery Nikolaevich. Noticing Malyutin's confusion, Berlikov explained that Gagiev was affiliated with the secret services, and this secrecy was necessary. This revelation reinforced the layers of intrigue surrounding Gagiev's role in the FLK, where his true identity was concealed even from high-ranking insiders. Although Malyutin left the FLK in 2004, he returned 3 years later to assume the role of director, a move allegedly orchestrated by Gagiev himself. In this position, Malyutin became instrumental in supporting the family's operations. His authority within the company allowed him to fulfill various logistical and financial needs for the brothers. "Malyutin was providing for all the guys I knew, the guys in the family," testified Dmitry Kodoev, a brother, during court proceedings. Kodoev detailed how Malyutin allocated large sums of money to assist family members who were evading law enforcement, including covering the costs of safe houses for fugitives. As the financial leasing company descended into chaos in the late 2000s, the once powerful entity that had served as both a legitimate business and a front for the family's operations began to fracture. By 2008 or 2009, internal divisions among the company's leadership sparked fierce conflicts, with multiple factions vying for control. What had been a tightly controlled operation unraveled into a free-for-all, with billions of rubles earmarked for developing Russia's commercial aviation industry vanishing into thin air. The collapse of the FLK's finances triggered a cascade of criminal investigations and disputes. As government funds evaporated, tensions between the company's formal executives and the family's informal leaders escalated. The rift ultimately spilled into violence. In March 2011, these tensions came to a head when the brothers abducted FLK director Nail Malyutin. Taken to a house on the outskirts of Moscow, Malyutin was forced to face Aslan big brother Gagiev. According to testimonies from family members, Gagiev accused Malyutin of embezzling company funds and dismissing key personnel loyal to the family, all while the FLK hurtled toward bankruptcy. The confrontation turned physical as Gagiev reportedly beat Malyutin and delivered a chilling ultimatum: "I won't be able to explain to my people if you leave here alive." Despite the threat, Malyutin was eventually released. Fearing for his life, Malyutin fled to Austria just days later. His escape was short-lived. He was arrested and extradited back to Russia. In May 2018, Malyutin was convicted on separate charges of embezzling FLK funds and sentenced to 6 years in prison. In hindsight, Malyutin's fate could be considered fortunate compared to that of his deputy, Andrei Berlikov. Berlikov had long been a target of Gagiev's wrath. In Gagiev's eyes, Berlikov had siphoned off money from the FLK and disappeared, refusing to maintain contact. Brother Georgy Dzagitov later recounted to investigators how the family began hunting for Berlikov. In June 2011, while driving near the Krasnopresnensky embankment in Moscow, Dzagitov and another brother spotted a dark blue Bentley, a car matching Berlikov's. They followed it to the Khutorok restaurant, where they confirmed Berlikov was a regular visitor. Over the next few months, the brothers tracked Berlikov's movements, waiting for an opportunity to act. On September 29, 2011, the opportunity arose. Yevgeny Yashkin and Ruslan Yurtov were tasked with carrying out the assassination. While Yurtov had once been hesitant even to dispose of a body, by this point his reservations had been worn away. He entered the restaurant, confirmed Berlikov's presence, and briefly excused himself to the bathroom. There, he donned gloves, retrieved a firearm, and approached Berlikov's table. Without hesitation, Yurtov fired at close range, killing Berlikov instantly and critically injuring his common-law wife, Anna Etkina. Although Etkina survived, the attack sent a clear message: betrayal of the family came at a steep price. The FLK officially declared bankruptcy the following year, in 2012. The billions of rubles that had flowed through the company were never recovered. Among the debts left unpaid was a 24 million ruble loan, approximately $760,000, issued to Grupa Attaché, a company owned by Sergei Safronov. The money had been withdrawn and never returned. When investigators later searched the abandoned base used by Grupa Attaché, they found little more than traces of blood, a grim reminder of the violent acts committed there. The collapse of the FLK and the violent feuds among its leaders signaled the beginning of the end for the family. Once a tightly coordinated organization, the group dissolved into chaos as its members turned on one another. Financial greed and internal betrayals eroded the bonds that had once united them, leaving a trail of embezzlement, murder, and dismembered corpses in their wake. The downfall of the family unfolded in a dramatic and harrowing sequence of betrayal, paranoia, and self-destruction. By 2009, cracks in the organization's foundation began to show, leading to its eventual collapse. One of the pivotal moments came when Robert Gagiev, a key member, was placed on a wanted list after a brother implicated him in a murder. To evade capture, Gagiev sought refuge in one of the safe houses rented by the family, part of a well-oiled system to protect members pursued by the authorities. Gagiev later described how the family provided sanctuary to its fugitives. Those wanted by the police would live in one of the dachas the family had specifically rented for hiding. They lived quietly, avoided public places, and had all their needs taken care of by the family. Meanwhile, false documents were prepared for them so they could eventually leave the country under new identities, he recounted to investigators. Around 2010, Gagiev and other wanted brothers were brought to a dacha near Moscow. During their stay, Aslan big brother Gagiev arrived to deliver unsettling news. According to Gagiev, Gagiev explained that the family was in disarray. Long-standing members Sergei Beglarian and Maxim Nikolaev had allegedly turned against him, plotting to kill him and other brothers. Gagiev insisted that they act preemptively to eliminate the traitors. As tensions mounted, the family set its sights on locating Nikolaev. Brother Ruslan Yurtov tracked him down and persuaded him to meet with Gagiev. Witnesses later recalled how the two men, Nikolaev, the family's most prolific killer, and Gagiev, its leader, spent an entire night talking. Gagiev demanded to know why Nikolaev wanted to betray the family. Nikolaev admitted that Beglarian had convinced him to turn against the group. The conversation ended on what appeared to be a reconciliatory note. The two men embraced, and Gagiev invited Nikolaev to the dacha to formally seek forgiveness from the other brothers. Nikolaev agreed, seemingly ready to make amends. But the truce was an illusion. As soon as they left the meeting, Nikolaev panicked. He bolted, yelling, "Help, police!" It was a desperate act of self-preservation from a man who had orchestrated countless deaths, but now feared he would be the next victim. His attempt to escape failed. He was apprehended and brought to the dacha, where his fate was sealed. Nikolaev and Yurtov, whose loyalty was now in question due to his association with Nikolaev, were restrained with tape and confined to a workout room. Gagiev convened a meeting with the other brothers to confront Nikolaev. The interrogation was intense and lasted for hours, with every brother present witnessing the proceedings. Under the weight of scrutiny, Nikolaev confessed. He admitted not only to betraying the family by conspiring with its enemies, but also to leaking information to the police, where he had continued working as an undercover informant. His admissions confirmed the depth of his betrayal. As the evening wore on, Gagiev called for a vote among the brothers to decide Nikolaev's fate. Each member voiced their opinion, and the overwhelming consensus was to execute him. The man who had once been the family's deadliest enforcer was now at the mercy of the group he had served so faithfully. The demise of the family reached its most harrowing moments in a sequence of violent retribution and unraveling loyalty. The brothers, following their grim code, returned to the workout room where Maxim Nikolaev was being held. In a cruel twist of fate, the man who had taken countless lives met his end in the same manner he had executed others, a plastic bag placed over his head, sealed with tape. He suffocated to death as Ruslan Yurtov, bound and helpless, was forced to witness the grim act. Robert Gagiev later recalled how suspicions had immediately shifted to Yurtov following Nikolaev's confession. Nikolaev had admitted to plotting against some brothers, and given that Yurtov had brought Nikolaev into the family and was heavily influenced by Sergei Beglarian, doubts about his loyalty arose, he said. Despite the tension, Aslan big brother Gagiev decided to spare Yurtov's life after speaking with him. The next day, Yurtov found himself participating in a horrific task. He helped dismember Nikolaev's body, severing the limbs and head. The remains were discarded in the woods along a roadside, and the severed body parts were burned. However, the winter snows that concealed the remains began to melt, prompting the brothers to revisit the site in February 2011. Fearing discovery, they retrieved the body and buried it in a more secure location. Their efforts to hide Nikolaev's remains were ultimately in vain. In August 2015, a top-secret police unit uncovered the mutilated corpse near the 11th kilometer of the Moscow-St. Petersburg highway, just 70 meters from the road. By then, the family's unraveling had reached a critical point, marked by internal betrayals and escalating violence. The brothers turned their sights on Sergei Beglarian, who had been a central figure in Nikolaev's defection. 2 failed assassination attempts were made on Beglarian's life. The first occurred at the Lodoknaya Street Cafe, where he was lured into an ambush. However, in a stroke of luck, the guns of both assassins malfunctioned, and Beglarian escaped unharmed. It wasn't until 2012 that the brothers finally located the house where he was hiding. That night, they ambushed him, riddling his car with gunfire and ending his life. The fallout extended to other prominent members of the family. In 2012, Oleg Gagiev, the South Ossetian counterintelligence operative, was convicted of 7 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. His downfall signaled the loss of another influential brother. Meanwhile, Yevgeny Yashkin, the former Interior Ministry operative who had played a key role in many of the family's crimes, suffered a complete mental collapse. Diagnosed with schizophrenia after years of participating in murders, Yashkin experienced a nervous breakdown. The Moscow City Court ordered his release into compulsory psychiatric treatment, effectively ending his criminal career. As for Yurtov, the reluctant participant who had increasingly found himself complicit in the family's atrocities, he awaited trial from his detention center. Consumed by guilt, he wrote a letter to Anastasia Berlikova, the daughter of Andrei Berlikov, the FLK director he had assassinated. In the letter, he begged for forgiveness. "I am deeply sorry and repent for what I have done. I brought grief to you and your family. I can't forgive myself and have no right to. I will carry this guilt with me for the rest of my life," he wrote, expressing remorse for his actions. As the family disintegrated, its leader, Aslan Gagiev, fled Russia for Austria, seeking refuge from the chaos he had helped create. The once powerful organization, which had operated with impunity for years, crumbled under the weight of its own betrayals, leaving a trail of shattered lives and unburied secrets. The story of the family, built on violence and loyalty, ended as a cautionary tale of how even the most formidable alliances can be undone by greed, paranoia, and the inescapable consequences of their actions. In 2015, Aslan Gagiev delivered a final, impassioned plea to the Austrian court, hoping to avoid the fate that awaited him in Russia. Standing before the judges, he spoke not just as a fugitive seeking refuge, but as a man who had endured a life of unrelenting turmoil and violence. "I have no chance of surviving," Gagiev began, his voice heavy with resignation. "I've experienced so much in my life. Death doesn't scare me anymore. Since 2004, I've felt like nothing more than an empty shell, a mere shadow of a living person. Every organ in my body has been damaged. There's not a single part of me that remains whole. All I ask is that you understand my position," he pleaded, his tone both defiant and despairing. Gagiev then turned his focus to Austria, contrasting it with the corruption and chaos of his homeland. He spoke with rare emotion about what he had come to admire in the country that had offered him temporary refuge. "I am deeply grateful to the Austrian community," he said, his voice softening. "Here, my children are receiving a proper education. They aren't afraid to step outside and walk down the streets. That is a privilege I never knew growing up. Since arriving in this country, I haven't seen a single stray dog or cat. That alone speaks volumes about the culture and humanity of this society. It's a level of dignity and respect for life that I wish my own people could experience." Despite his heartfelt words, the court's decision was inevitable. For all his attempts to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, Gagiev's crimes could not be ignored. The Austrian court ruled to extradite him back to Russia, a country governed by the same figures he had once considered allies but who had since become his greatest enemies. In the end, the justice Gagiev feared most was the justice he received. Sent back to the land of his birth, he was left to face a system as unforgiving as the world he had helped create. His final appeal in Austria was not just a plea for his life, but an acknowledgement of the stark divide between the life he had lived and the life he had glimpsed in a society far removed from his own. It was a poignant, if futile, testament to a man who had spent years navigating a world of violence, only to find himself yearning for the peace he had long denied others.